The 36th argument that's used against the existence of God, that's found on the website godisimaginary.com, is entitled "God is Impossible." And the argument essentially is that a basic agreed-upon definition of God, which is kind of an interesting point in the argument, that even though elsewhere the author highlights conflicting understandings of God, in this article he wants to admit that there's a common core understanding of God that is shared among the monotheistic religions of the world. And that common core understanding is inherently contradictory. And he highlights several different areas in which the very notion of God is said to be incoherent. So this is sort of a philosophical argument or series of arguments, and I'd like to offer some brief suggestions about where to go in responding to these arguments. The first one that I think takes the better part of the article is the problem of evil. And there's a classic statement of the argument that God either can or cannot or will not take evil from the world, because obviously the world exhibits evil. That's the assumption of the argument, is that there is evil in the world. Since there is evil in the world, and if God exists, apparently God either cannot or will not eliminate evil from the world. If God cannot take evil from the world, then he is not omnipotent. If God will not take evil from the world, then he is not good or benevolent, or omnibenevolent it's sometimes called. So the argument here is that if there is a God, then he either would or could, and both, he would and could eliminate evil from the world. But God will not or cannot, one or the other or both, eliminate evil from the world, and therefore there must not be in existence a God. So the argument here is from evil, that the very presence of evil in the world is inconsistent or incompatible with the idea of an all-powerful and all-good God. Maybe God is, the way the argument is usually offered, is maybe God, could get rid of evil, but he doesn't choose to do so, and therefore he can't be good. And that, of course, wouldn't be very helpful to a Christian who insists that God is good. So the atheist here seems to get us in a trap of either God is omnipotent and yet evil, or God is good and can't seem to get rid of evil in the world. Now, there are all kinds of ways that Christians and Jews and Muslims, I'm sure, have offered responses to this particular argument. One that I especially like is the way that C.S. Lewis responded to this argument. C.S. Lewis used this argument against Christianity and belief in God for a good amount of time, and then he came to see that it is internally contradictory. The argument itself is contradictory because it assumes to make a judgment upon God for the existence of evil in the world. But the very judgment that something is evil presupposes some ultimate standard of goodness by which I determine that something is evil. If there is no ultimate standard of evil, if evil turns out to be just my subjective feelings about things that I don't like, let's say, which I think many atheists hold to that position. At least that's my experience. I watched a discussion between some Christian pastors and some atheists here recently, or about 6 months ago or so. And the atheist side, every person on the atheist side, and they were some pretty prominent representatives of atheism, all of them argued for a moral relativistic standpoint, that morality is just a kind of subjective expression of what we like or don't like, and that there is no moral objectivity at all. There is no objective basis of good and evil. It's just what we like or what we don't like as human beings. Now, an atheist might want to disagree with that, and I'd be happy to hear what an atheist has to say who would argue that there is an objective standard of determining what good and evil are. But if we take the moral relativist position, that there is no objective standard of what right and wrong are, then to say that God can't exist because God fails to live up to a standard of morality or a standard of goodness is a hollow argument, because there is no such standard of goodness. What C.S. Lewis comes to see is that if God in fact is supreme, if God is the first reality, then if there is any such thing as evil in the world, then it can only be determined to be evil. It can only be really and truly evil because it diverges from, or it's in contrast to, or it conflicts with the supreme standard of goodness, which is God himself. And so I think what the atheist does, even though obviously the argument is perplexing and difficult because it requires that we think about why would God allow evil to exist in the world. But what C.S. Lewis's response, I think, does, and I've never seen an effective response to it. I've read quite a number of them, but I've never seen anyone effectively eliminate the fundamental point here, which is that evil presupposes some objective standard of supreme standard of goodness, or else the argument becomes purely subjective. And a pure subjective determination of something being evil and using that as an argument against God is a very, very weak one. And so the atheist, I think, undercuts his own position by arguing that God doesn't exist because there's evil in the world. The atheist thereby loses the ability to judge that something is objectively evil. So I think that to me is the fundamental problem with the atheist argument against God from evil. And then furthermore, I would say that as perplexing as the argument is and as difficult as it is, especially whenever we're struggling with some presence of evil in our own lives, within ourselves or in the world about us, or some horrible thing that may happen in the world, whenever we struggle with such things, it's very difficult for us to rationally contemplate how that could be meaningful or how that might fit into some larger purpose of God. But I would only suggest to you this, that even in our own experience, our regular experience as human beings, we find that there are sufferings that we allow ourselves to go through because we see some greater end in view, some greater goal in view. For example, we may put ourselves through, the physical pains of, maybe boot camp for an army soldier, or maybe the rigors of an athletic almost torture that a person might go through, or maybe some struggle that a person puts themselves through for the good of another person, maybe searching out for them, or putting a person in danger, or oneself in danger, because they're trying to rescue someone else. And so we see that temporary sufferings are sometimes allowed as an avenue or as a medium towards some higher goal or some higher end. I would suggest that if we could see from the divine perspective, if we could see all of reality at once, and we can't, of course, we can only see little pieces of it, we can only see our own little part of it, and get glimpses of the bigger picture at times. But if we could see the larger framework and the larger achievement that's being accomplished through this, we might in fact come away with a very different conclusion about why would God allow the world to be as it is. It may well be that a world like this is essential to there being true freedom, and maybe the allowance of free moral beings in this world is essential to achieving a greater world in the end. To rule that out as a possibility presupposes that a person knows where history is going, and knows that it cannot achieve this greater end or greater purpose by allowing the possibility of such evils in the world. Again, that may not be satisfactory or fully rationally satisfactory to our minds, but it is a reality that I don't think can rule out as a possibility, and therefore the argument from evil fails to decisively show that God cannot exist. And then to go back to C.S. Lewis's argument, the argument against God from evil decisively fails because it fails to provide a basis for objective moral judgments upon God absent the existence of God. And if in fact God exists, then he becomes the supreme standard of all that is good, because he's the first reality, the supreme reality, and atheism has no alternative to that. Now, there were a couple of other arguments that are presented here trying to show that there's some type of contradiction in the attributes of God. The second one that I'd like to focus on is an argument from God's omniscience. The author argues that if God knows everything, if God sees everything, then human actions can't be free. For example, if God knows that 10 years from now I will make this choice rather than that choice, then certainly my action 10 years from now can't be free. So the fact that God knows everything is incompatible with undetermined free acts of human beings. This, I think, is a failure to understand what is meant by God's omniscience. By God's omniscience is not meant that God sort of travels through time like we do, and he sees future time in the present moment. Instead, we believe that God's relationship to time is dramatically different than our relationship to time. God sees every now moment simultaneously. We journey through now moments through what we call time, or the succession of time. And so the fact that God sees now and sees the freedom of now does not take away the freedom of this moment, nor does the fact that God sees moments that to us are future now moments, God sees them in his eternal present. To say that this is impossible presupposes that a person understands the nature of God's knowledge uninhibited by the constraints of time, or not. God's knowledge is not meted out in moments, successive moments. It's interesting to me that on this particular point, there are lots of theoretical scientific thinkers, especially in the area of cosmology and physics and those areas, in more speculative efforts to try to understand what time is, and our experience of sequence and moments and succession of time. There are no less than 40 or 50 different identifiable theories. I saw a special edition, I think, of Time magazine recently, where it offered a whole bunch of different, like, 2-page summaries of different theories about time and how human free acts are related to time, or whether or not there is such a thing as human freedom in time. But the only point I make from referring to that particular collection of articles is that even within the world of science, there is no clear understanding of what is meant by time, and how human actions are related to either the progress of time or the simultaneous presence of all of time that we are experiencing in sort of a conscious movement of moments or sequences. In any case, I don't think that this question is some type of demonstration of an incompatibility of God's omniscience with human freedom. It's a complex enough subject and a difficult enough subject, and there are ways of understanding God's omniscience in relationship to human freedom that do not run into a necessary contradiction like we see here. The third argument that's used here, that I'll just have to very briefly throw out, but I think we can do it in a couple minutes, is that the argument goes like this, that God is supposedly the originator of the creation, according to the definition of God that he begins with, and I would agree with that what we mean by God is that he is the origin, the reason why there is a world, the creator of the world. And he goes on to say that the argument is made then that God is the origin of the world because the world needs a cause. The world needs a reason why it exists. And so he goes on to ask the question, well, how can it be that everything must have a creator while God must not? It's the classic argument that if the universe needs a creator, then God needs a creator, and therefore God is no solution to the problem of where did the world come from, because it only delays the problem. We have to go on to God. This, I think, is an absolutely horrible argument because I don't know of any careful Christian theologian or philosopher who has ever said that everything must have a cause. Obviously, that would be contradictory. If I say everything must have a cause and God doesn't have a cause, I'd be contradicting myself. Certainly, people like Thomas Aquinas and others were not so foolish as to offer such an internally contradictory kind of argument. Not at all. The way their arguments go is they say that there are features of the world that point us to the need for a cause of the world. In the case of Aquinas and elsewhere in another presentation, I make this case a little bit more clearly. In the case of Aquinas, the argument is that we see in the world things that are undergoing motion. Motion requires actualizers of those motions or changes, and therefore we begin a search for actualizers that leads us into either an infinite regress that is unsupported by anything, it's just an endless series of things that don't explain ultimately themselves, or we have to get to a reality that does explain itself. But in any case, and you can look at those arguments on your own, but in any case, this particular argument is a total misrepresentation of those who have offered philosophical arguments for the existence of God, because those who have done so, and have done so carefully, which is almost all of them that I've seen in any formal way offered arguments for God, they conclude that God is the uncaused origin of a world that does need a cause because it exhibits the characteristics of things that do not fully account for themselves, like motion or change or directionality or that kind of thing. And there are lots of different arguments and ways that they've been formulated. So my conclusion is that the argument fails. God is not impossible, that there is no necessary contradiction between the definition of God, or what we mean by God, and the realities of human logic and the world around us.